Welcome to Tigray Television. I'm Nimana Am with today's news. Stay tuned. A detained ethnic Tigrayan who is a member of the Ethiopian army says prisoners languishing despite the signing of the peace deal. He says this in secret telephone conversation with Tigray Television reporters from Wendotika, a military camp repurposed into prison after the war broke out in Tigray. Sarun Tigray reports.
The Washington Post, after a year, uncovered the hidden massacre of 83 ethnic Tigrayans, who were former members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. The ethnic Tigrayans were killed by prison guards and villagers in November of 2021 at a concentration camp in Ma'rab Abaya, southern Ethiopia. To this day, tens of thousands of ethnic Tigrayan former members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, not only in Ma'rab Abaya, but in many makeshift prisons all over the country, continue to languish despite the signing of a peace agreement in early November. We were able to contact a former member of the Ethiopian Army who spoke to us on condition of unanimity for security issues as he is still detained in Wendotika, southern Ethiopia. The soldier was detained at the outset of the war in November of 2020 while at work. He tells us that at least 7 Tigrayan prisoners were brutally killed inside the prison, including Gebramariam Stefanos, who wished to build a better life for his family back home. Gebramariam was beaten and stoned to death by Ethiopian soldiers inside the prison in November 8 of 2021.
Gebramariam Stefanos هزي بأمني ببتري قطعته زموات مالتي حدا ورا على مسؤول تعرفوا نخلت محاسب منيرم حدا جن لأن حمش تور حمودة بعلنا وذي فريت جرنا نحكمنا سلا بعلم يتزنورنا جزم دعواتنا وذي حكمنا يوم مالتي تعرفوا حدا تعرفوا تحرموا.
This Tigrayan detainee, who has been imprisoned for more than 2 years solely for his Tigrayan identity, tells us the living conditions inside the prison remain eerily similar even after the deal.
حزا سربيتنا عميز أسل حكمنا يقولوا صوري 6 ما يقولوا عصرت 3 ساعات نينكو تخافيتك عصرت 3 ساعات بشتيقة تأسو إن بأمامن بخالي استفالاليو نقراتن نساقاينا زلنا من مستمع لنقر يولون مرك أسوون يولون أب مريتين عندكس.
Not heard from his family members back in Tigray, who have been living under a complete communications blackout for 2 years now. He doesn't know which family members survived the widespread killings of civilians in Tigray and which ones didn't. His families also don't know his whereabouts. He says he is happy that the suffering of the people in Tigray could finally come to an end with the signing of an agreement, but wishes him and many like him could be made a part of the deal so that he can finally
ቤተሰብ ኣብ ትግራይ እዮም ዘለዉ ማንም ድምፆም ካብ ዝሰምዕ 2 ዓመት ይኮይኑኒ ድሃዮም ኣይፈልጥን ይሃለዉ ኣይሃለዉ ምንም ዝፈልጦ ጉዳይ የብለይ መብዛሕተና እንኮልዮም
Millions of parents in Tigray are no longer able to provide food for their starving children ever since the economy in the region collapsed due to the gruesome war and termination of basic services in the past 2 years. Dedicated youngsters who have been trying to organize a community-based support to feed the starved children at Housing Square every day are also unable to collect the amount of support they need to feed these children. Aragagar Mikhail has more. This report following a story from Washington Post on Sunday that has uncovered the massacre of 83 Tigrayans in an internment camp in Ma'rab Abaya, southern Ethiopia. For more on this, we are joined by Desta Haile Selassie, civil rights activist and a member of Tighat Media from Washington, D.C. Desta, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Desta, let's begin with your reaction. You've consistently been saying that members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces who were detained right after the war broke out in November of 2020. What did you feel when you read the story from Washington Post on the massacre of Tigrayans?
Yes, as part of the Victims List compilation project we do at Tighat Media, I have been closely following up this story for about a year now, since December 2021. Soon after we heard about this heartbreaking massacre, we tried to approach a lot of international media outlets like the CNN, the BBC, the Reuters, the Associated Press, including international human rights organizations like the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. But they were not willing, for some reason, they were not willing to investigate and write a story about this massacre. But finally, we approached the Washington Post, and they agreed to investigate it and write a report about it. And they released yesterday the report, the same report that you mentioned earlier. And this report covers very heartbreaking stories about 83 Tigrayan victims who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force. So on behalf of these victims and my fellow Tigrayans, I would like to extend my gratitude to the journalist her name is Catherine, and her team at the Washington Post for bringing actually this heartbreaking story into the spotlight of the international media mainstream. Yes, you're right. I have been repeatedly talking about these crimes for a long time, and the reason is just because I knew about these crimes. Over the past 2 years, a lot of crimes have been committed against ethnic Tigrans across many detention centers in Ethiopia, and I have been in contact with a lot of credible eyewitnesses, medical doctors, survivors, and family members of the victims.
Our reporters have verified that situations remain in Wendotika, southern Ethiopia, one of the imprisonment camps that remained even after signing of the peace deal. Desta, do you think there could have been a mechanism that would have prevented the death of those civilians?
I think it's always good to remember that the target against Tigrans, who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, started way before the war on Tigray broke out, which means before November 2020. For example, you can take the assassination of General Sa'are Mokonnen and General Gezai Aberra, and the mass detention of Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, and this was actually admitted by the Ethiopian government. For example, the Ethiopian general, if I remember his name correctly, Tesfaye Ayalo, publicly admitted that the Ethiopian government mass detained Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force. The heartbreaking story we read yesterday at the Washington Post includes stories about 83 ethnic Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, and many of them were deployed in South Sudan, in Somalia, and other countries under the United Nations peacekeeping mission. So the United Nations as an organization had the right to protect the lives of these victims. It's not only the United Nations, including the Africa Union and the international community at large. Many ethnic Tigrayans actually refused to return from South Sudan to Ethiopia, and then they sought asylum in South Sudan. So that means the United Nations had full knowledge of what was going against the ethnic Tigrayans who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force.
And what do you think should be done right now to protect the remaining Tigrayans from further crimes?
What I think should be done now are three things, in my opinion. The first thing is that the United Nations and the African Union should seriously investigate the Ma'rab Abaya massacre reported by the Washington Post yesterday. As far as my information is concerned, the Ma'rab Abaya massacre was carried out under the full knowledge of the Ethiopian government, mainly the Ethiopian National Intelligence Unit led by Temasgen Truneh. Number two, as per the peace agreement signed in South Africa and in Kenya, the remaining Tigrayan detainees, be it civilians or those who were members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, should be released. At least the United Nations and the African Union and the international community, they should demand for their release. Number three, it's a plea for the international human rights investigators that they should follow suit and right the crimes committed against Tigrans. If the international community failed to do these three things, in my opinion now, I'm sure the government of Abiy Ahmed will continue to assassinate high-profile Tigrayans who are languishing in detention centers in Ethiopia.
All right, Desta, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me once again.
You're watching Tigray Television News Report. Millions of parents in Tigray are no longer able to provide food for their starving children ever since the economy in the region collapsed due to the gruesome war and termination of basic services in the past 2 years. Dedicated youngsters who've been trying to organize a community-based support to feed the starved children at Housing Square every day are also unable to collect the amount of support they need to feed these children. Aragay Garamkel has more.
Here in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, members of the Young Men Christian Association, in collaboration with the Organization for Social Service, Health and Development, have been holding a breakfast feeding program for children for over a year now by raising a community-based support. Yerga Gabramedhin, coordinator of the program, says the number of children beneficiaries of the program has declined greatly from day to day, as the support from the community dwindled due to the economic crisis.
A total of 4 sites we were managing. One is totally for the IDP children in Sabakare. The 3 sites were for the host community, children from host community. But now it's only 1 site which is functioning that we are observing now. Why we reduce from 4 to 1 is because of lack of support.
Yerga added that it is truly painful to turn back starved children every day due to lack of support.
It's very painful to see a child coming here, but because we don't have any bread, sending them back is very painful. We are experiencing painful times.
According to Yerga, in addition to the breakfast feeding program, the youngsters are helping the children to get child-based psychosocial therapy and informal education.
The children is not going to school, is impacting their future. So we start informal education. So after this program, they will go to the YMCA compound, so they will receive at least informal education, at least to remind them how to write and read. This is what we are doing. In addition to that, I believe the war and its impact in the children is heavy. I observe when they heard some noise, even a truck passing, you see them shocking. That means this is from the drone attack and war jet attacks they observe in a previous time. So trauma healing is important for them. So a child-friendly psychosocial support should be provided. That's what we are doing.
Yerga also says the feeding program will have been faded out once basic services are resumed in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, as the parents of the children would be able to get access to their savings and feed their own children.
The moment the bank open, this program will die. So we are waiting in a very hopeful spirit, commercial activities to be started, banks to be operated, and to stop this program.
Yerga calls to all Ethiopians to support the signed peace agreement and suggests the Tigrayan and Ethiopian governments to be committed to implement the signed agreement on the ground.
My first call is to all citizens who love peace to support this peace agreement. For the conflicting parties, now they are not conflicting parties. They are parties in agreement for peace. So my call is to keep their promise We are observing a good steps. Aid is already arriving. The problem is it's not to the level of the reality in the ground. I hope it will be increased. And there are other activities that we are expecting, including the activation of bank, telecommunication, and so on.
Ma'aza Haddouche, a mother of 4, says she's lost her husband due to lack of medical supplies. Ma'aza expresses her regret that her husband would have been saved had the peace deal been implemented earlier. Let's take a look at the details. Countless who desire to see the end of war, thrilled to hear about the peace agreement, now worry the agreement might not be put into action, as this month has passed by with no significant improvements seen. Ma'aza Haddouche, a mother of 4 who has recently lost her husband due to the siege-induced lack of medication, says the war and the siege that followed caused her colossal damage, rendering her unable to work, to take care of her children, and leaving her in starvation and despair.
My husband, Highlight Takhlouk, used to take care of the whole family. He was a carpenter, but he has recently passed away due to an untreated illness. Before the war had broken out, I used to sell vegetables for a living, but I was forced to close it down due to the siege, and now I don't have anyone to help me. I have only survived with the help of some relatives. I don't have anything.
In addition to losing her husband, Ma'aza says the shortage of medical supplies made her daughter unable to receive any treatment when she got heavily injured due to a car accident.
Look at my daughter. She has been run over by a motor bicycle and she has not received any treatment as there are no medical supplies in the region.
Her 11-year-old daughter, Helen, expresses how deep of an impact her father's passing and the war have had on her and wishes to live in peace and continue her studies now that the peace agreement has been reached.
The passing of my father makes me very sad. I want peace and I would like to continue my studies. We also need food aid to enter and banks to reopen.
Ma'aza, explaining how excited the peace agreement has made her, says ensuring the implementation of the agreement is as equally important as signing the agreement.
I have gotten my hopes up since the peace agreement has been reached, but the agreement has to be implemented and seen on the ground. If peace prevails, I can even forget all the hardships that I've been through and raise my children properly.
Ma'aza pleads with the international community and the UN to ensure the proper execution of the agreement, reminding how the delay puts the lives of millions at stake.
We are sleeping on an empty stomach. The UN needs to put pressure and help bring aid. Humanitarian aid, especially medical supplies, needs to enter Tigray immediately.
Baruhabay, Executive Director of Walad wa Midhan Association for HIV Patients, says more than 15,000 members of the association still remain at risk due to lack of antiretroviral drugs. Sablot Lama reports.
The war that started 2 years ago has brought devastation for millions in Tigray, including people with chronic illnesses, especially HIV-positive patients. Barihu Abbay, Executive Director of Walad wa Midhan Association for HIV-positive patients in Tigray, says more than 15,000 members of the association continue to suffer as a result of lack of food and medication. He added the association was founded to support the HIV-positive patients, which it could not accomplish now due to the war.
Walad wa Midhan Association of Tigray was established in 2001. In addition to our office here, we were able to expand to 37 districts in Tigray. We had 3,675 members in Maghala and more than 15,000 members across Tigray. Now our members are decreasing as a result of death and other reasons. We now have 2,441 members in Maghala. In addition to that, many members have died due to lack of medication. We continue to suffer because there is no medication. For example, we have lost a pregnant woman because she couldn't get proper medical follow-up. Everyone is stressed now.
The executive director added that they were unable to receive the necessary humanitarian aid, including ART drugs, during the war. However, the current peace deal signed in Pretoria has brought them a glimmer of hope for their survival.
People like us with chronic illness have suffered a lot. Especially those of us taking antiretroviral therapy have found living difficult because we couldn't eat the nutrition necessary for our survival. We were taking expired medication or type of medication that we stopped taking due to its side effects. but we are happy about the peace deal. We were the main victims of the war.
He said despite the peace deal, members of the organization continue to live in agony as they haven't received medications necessary for their survival. He finally shared his message to the international community and both governments to bring sustainable peace and save lives.
It
has been a month since the agreement, but we got nothing. Our members have stopped taking their medications long ago. We have members that stopped taking medication 90 or 120 days ago. We don't have the device to measure viral load and medication used by pregnant women to prevent the spread of the infection to the baby. Therefore, both parties should build trust and facilitate for a sustainable peace. Basic needs such as food and medication shouldn't have been brought to negotiation in the first place. There is peace now, but there isn't any medications that come to any of us. As we are in a horrific situation right now, there should be urgent humanitarian assistance reaching us. I call on the international and the diaspora community to help us to the extent possible.
While the world celebrated World AIDS Day 2 days ago, a report from Health Professionals Network for Tigray shows more than 46,000 HIV-positive patients in Tigray suffer due to lack of ART.
Office of Electric Power Supply in Northern Region says it has not made any communication with the main office in Addis Ababa. The office adds there is no concrete action on the ground, despite hopes for resumption of electric power in Tigray following the peace agreement in Pretoria. Abraha Garante has more.
Girmay Gidey, communication officer at Ethiopian Electric Power Supply Authority in the Northern Region, says the office has not yet communicated with the main office in Addis Ababa. Despite its readiness to receive directions from the main office and resume its work following the peace agreement between the federal government of Ethiopia and the government of Tigray, the officer says no steps have been taken so far to change the status quo.
تتحيزو أنحنا كم جلجالات إلكتريك تسمعنا ندقفوينا ندولينا.
We support the peace agreement on our part. Our people have suffered a lot due to electric power blackout, and they need relief now. Without power supply, there would be no access to pure water and no health service. We are glad to hear about the peace agreement, but we want it implemented. We haven't made any communication with the main office in Addis Ababa as the communication blackout persists. The main office hasn't communicated us on what we should do on our part either.
The communication manager also affirmed that his office is ready to follow directions from the federal authorities. He explains his hopes of resumption of power supply into the region that has been under power blackout for the last 2 years following the war in Tigray.
ምናልባት ኮይኑ ግን እንድሕር ርክቡ ተተፈጢሩ ሞ ከምቲ ዓንተ ዞርሁ ላ መሬት ልወርድ ትኮይኑ
If the federal authorities tell us to start our job, we are ready to do so. Our employees are on standby to work day and night to serve their people. But we have fuel and cash problems. Our vehicles have also been taken, especially those which were in western, southwestern and central zones. But we are ready to start with what we have.
According to the communication manager, huge damage have been inflicted on the power stations and it needs significant maintenance or reinstallations to make the resumption of power a reality in Tigray.
أزي تمسمر بللو هافتي ويدمو بللك نبرت تصقين هلا سرح لمقتاو ችግር لله يمسلنا.
It is possible to maintain electric lines with what we have, but there are basic equipments that we don't have, including transformers and transformer oils. We don't know what has happened to our installation in western Tigray, as we haven't accessed the area for more than 2 years. Almost half of the equipment and installations in the 46 substations we have the access are completely destroyed.
It has been 30 days since the peace agreement in Pretoria that underscored immediate resumption of basic services in Tigray was signed, but Tigray is still under complete power blackout.
Well, that's it for me today. Thank you for tuning in.